This is Apollo Road Podcast 001, my interview with Steve Malavolta. I'm going to keep this intro short. I'll start off with a bio from his website, and then we'll jump right into it. My puzzles are made with the intent to be played, creating both visual pleasure and intellectual challenges. Each puzzle piece is hand-cut and finished on both sides from select hardwoods. These puzzles range from single-layer entertainment to multi-layered sculptural challenges. My goal as a woodworker is to create an enjoyable, playable piece of art of heirloom quality, and my challenge to you is to find piece by piece. How long have you considered yourself an artist?
That's a good question. I've been in the arts retailing for probably 38 plus years.
38 years. Yeah, so you're definitely... You're one
I was
of
going to
the...
say, I think I did my first art show in about 1976 or 77.
Ooh, right on. So that was like the early days.
Yeah.
When it was really starting to kind of spread around the country, right?
Yeah, it was more local for me. The first one was actually in that downtown mall right by the downtown shopping section underneath by Second.
Oh.
What was that called?
The Galleria.
Yeah, in the Galleria.
Yeah, and this is downtown Albuquerque.
Exactly, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's good. But that's crazy. They don't really have any... They have galleries there, right? And that's like kind of the...
Yeah, they had a couple of galleries, a couple of eateries. I have no idea. I haven't been down there in probably decades, but that was my first attempt selling dulcimers.
Do you remember what the setup was like? Was it professional, or was it sort of
a folding table?
Yep.
I think I probably even put a cloth on it.
Yeah. So was that with your puzzles or jewelry? Or
No, that was with dulcimers. I was making dulcimers at the time.
Wow.
That was my first hit with woodworking. I sold a guitar to buy a radial arm saw because I wanted to figure out how to make a dulcimer. So that was my first woodworking tool.
Okay. So you played music, and then you're like, all right, I got to get into this woodworking thing.
Yeah, I think a buddy of mine showed up with a dulcimer one day, and I said, well, that's too easy. I mean, I was never any good at the guitar, so I could learn this one pretty quick. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I got rid of that beautiful little guitar for $125, bought a Craftsman radial arm saw, and tried my hand at making a dulcimer. Turned out pretty darn good, and turned into making a bunch for an art show.
Wow. So how long did it take you to make that first one? Was it kind of like as soon as you started, cutting things up, you knew you were good at it? You got a good feel for it?
Yeah, it was kind of funny. I used another woodworker to resaw some wood down to the thinness I needed. Mm-hmm. For curving the wood on an instrument, you have to steam it. So there was a laundromat over on Central that had a steamer for steaming out clothes, and that's where I would go to bend my wood.
Was this after hours?
No, it's in the middle of everything. Well, they're 24/7 anyway.
Okay, so if they slow down, they saw you walk in, they're like, oh yeah, I think we got some time.
Yeah, I don't think they had attendees. If
so
they did, they were probably asking questions like, whoa, what are you doing, dude? So, yeah, the first one came out pretty good, and other people saw it, and they said, hey, make me one, and that turned into 3, and then I said, well, I'll try doing an art show. And
how'd you get the idea to even, it's like, oh, I need to steam this wood. How can I, use tools that I don't have, right? Because that's like the hardest thing for an artist starting out is you have an idea, but you realize, each step of the way there's some tool or, machine or something that I don't have. And,
Well, I started, my first source was the Foxfire books. And there was actually a section in there that told you how to make a dulcimer and gave you an idea how to bend wood. There are a couple of different ways. Steaming was one of them. And then as you go along, as your passion falls into this, you say, now I need this tool. So you go out and buy a tool.
Right.
And you realize that opens a whole door of other techniques.
I know that well.
You could do, yeah. And before you know it, that now you gotta rent a space to do this in.
Right.
You got bigger than your garage, and that turns into building a shop and bringing it back home.
Yeah. So obviously now, almost 40 years later, you've got tools, a shop, a space, a lot of skill that you've built up over the years. And so you kind of remember that first dulcimer that you made, comparing it to your process now, just as an artist, you're always evolving, right? Can you remember what that felt like back then when you're like, oh man, I can't believe I made this, or, oh, this was, this came out okay, but I know I can do a better one?
Well, as I made each one, they did get better. Mm-hmm. A little bit smoother, a little bit cleaner, a little bit better sounding. You learn a little bit more about structure and technique. But also as you start making them and you present them for sale, you look at what it takes to refine the time invested. Now, the very first one, time made no difference.
Right. Yeah.
And I was all about it. I still have it. I made a case with felt and foam in it that holds it perfectly.
Right.
But as you start to get into the business part of it and realize I got to pay for these tools, I got to pay for overhead, you kind of smooth it out and you become more of becomes more of a production.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, well, see, you're smart. A lot of people, I think, maybe would go down the rabbit hole and just kind of get by as long as they can and never really take it that seriously, right? And immediately go into, okay, how can I refine it so that I can afford to do more shows or afford to buy better tools, right? So I think that's a smart approach of, saying, okay, I got something here, but I need to make it, efficient as I can.
Well, really, I've been self-employed all my life.
Yeah.
So if I jump into any kind of venue, I have to consider, is it going to support me? Is it going to make some money?
Right.
Is it going to improve itself?
Yeah.
If it doesn't support me, if it's not improving itself and it's not supporting me, then it's time to look for another venue or refine your approach, which might be maybe producing an item that can be made a little bit quicker and a little bit cheaper.
Right. How long does it take you to do that? Is that on the order of, a couple hours, couple days, maybe a month or two?
To
kind of make that decision. Well, to make the decision of,
how long do you go?
It's got some legs.
Well, you try to get out there before you're on a park bench.
Right. Right. So the first art show, you could say it's that table you set up right in the gallery in that basement. Do you remember how much you were selling things for, and whether you made enough to cover all your bills that show?
I'm sure I made enough to cover my bills because we're talking 40 years ago, and overhead was a lot less than it is now.
Yeah.
And there, like I said, it was a radial arm saw and a steamer down at the laundromat. So anything that came to me seemed like a good enough profit.
Sure.
And at that time, I was married, and there was steady income coming from the significant other.
Right. So you had a little cushion on that side.
Yeah.
Okay. See, that's I always wondered, some of the artists that I've met, they either had like a base to start from, or they were just wild motherfuckers and they just went for it, and you're like, oh, it's a lot of risk either way, but it takes a lot of guts, right, to jump out into whatever project you're.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it takes commitment.
Yeah.
There are artists out there who, like me in the very beginning, are supported by another half. It's not that I was supported, but if I didn't make it,
right,
we weren't going to crash over it.
Right.
But there are people out there, I mean, it takes commitment. So when you go out there And then as you start doing shows, you realize you need to refine it. And you look at what other people are doing, who have been doing it for years, and how they set up their booth. And it's a little bit more professional looking than what I was doing. And you say, well, I got to refine this more.
That's a great point. As soon as you get at that show, right, and you're like, all right, I'm here. I've got my wares, right? I've got my stuff. And you're like, oh, shit. You look around at your neighbors.
Yeah.
That's such a good point because, when you're starting out, you're just happy to be there, right? And you're having a good time, and you realize, oh, wow, there's actually professionals or people that do it part-time on the side. And then you definitely, you see the people that do it year round, couple every other week, right? They're driving across the country doing another show. And
yeah, that came much later. Then I got into making the wooden jigsaw puzzles.
Okay, so tell me how that started.
Well, that started with making a Christmas gift for my nephew. And it was really just a little stand-up puzzle. And a buddy of mine who had been making wooden buckles for a major company here in town had seen it. And he said, that's a cool idea. He said, make some up, and I'll bring them to one of the art shows. Now, art shows back in those days weren't quite as juried as they are now. I mean, you had to let people know what you were making, but you could slip stuff in. And so it was a hit. They were $8, $10, $12 might have been my highest puzzle.
My God, and that was what we're in the 80s now?
Yeah, we're probably late 70s.
Late 70s? Okay.
Yeah. So it became a hit, and actually we got together and did this as a partnership. And they evolved.
Yeah.
And in the beginning it was, I had a little BMW 2002, and I could fit the whole booth in there. You design your booth with a folding table and shelves that break down and a cloth, and so you could take off and drive to Austin, Texas, and do an art show in this little car, and it was a blast.
Right, and so these are 10 by 10 booths. If you don't have a good size reference, that's like, the size of a medium-sized bathroom.
Yeah, well, it depends on what home you're in.
Depends on what home, yeah. But it's not a lot of space when you set up all your tables and.
Yeah.
So to fit all of that in one of those little beamers, that's a pretty good feat.
And again, I was making puzzles, so I was the king of making things fit.
Right.
And I knew how to break things down and make them expand into a full-size booth again. But that's an interesting concept you brought about, the 10 by 10 foot space. And that's something I always thought about is I buy a piece of real estate temporarily for 2 days, 1 day, 3 days. And that's my space.
Right.
And you create it. You go in there, not only do you show your wares, but you create a space for the public to come in and enter your little home for that time, or your retail shop. I always made it a little bit more personal. I looked at it as you were entering my space.
Right.
And there's a space next to me and a space next to them, and they pick and choose who they want to go into by the presentation. When they walk by, is it just the item, or is it how you threw the item at them? It's like, wow, look at that backdrop.
That's also a really good point. That's I don't know that a lot of people really spend the time to think of it that way. That it's more than just a white tent on the street, right? It gets real cookie cutter when you are walking by all those tents, and it's just white tent. What are they selling? Keep walking, But that's such a good point that it's like, no, this is, a space, my property for the weekend. And, you're representing yourself, you're representing the show, and it really is for everybody's enjoyment. They just want to have a good time, right? And whether they buy work or not is, that's secondary to just being out, walking around, talking to people, learning.
There are shows out there where people just meander around.
Yeah.
There's food booths, there's entertainment, there's the artwork.
Just grab a turkey leg and go listen to the music.
Exactly. But I always felt when you walked into my tent, as you put it was personal space.
Yeah.
You came in there and it was time for you to interact with the artist, which is a really rare thing. A lot of people go out and buy artwork at a gallery. They get a little bit of background. They'll read a bio. Maybe the attendee at the gallery will tell them a little bit about this person. But it's a unique opportunity for the public to walk in and interact with the person who made it. And I always thought that was very special. You entered my life when you came into my space.
Right. I agree. Making a connection in person, it's like you start to see that, the artist, you see the twinkle in their eye when they're describing their work, and you kind of see that it's whatever the work is, whether it's 2D, 3D, your work is actually unique in that it's both 2D and 3D. It's
hands-on. It's playable.
Right. It's such a complicated item. You can't even really, call it one. It doesn't fit in one genre. But it makes all the difference when they see your enthusiasm for what you made and how you made it come through in person. And it's so lost when you're just kind of browsing in a catalog or in a gallery or, wherever you're looking, right?
I totally agree. And that was why I fell in love with the retail shows, because I got to interact with the people who purchased my items. And my best customers are the ones who actually came in and they wanted to know what I was about, what this puzzle was about. Is there a story behind it? Is it just a generic design, or how did you come about with this? Especially with my bigger pieces, there is a story and an evolution with that design.
Right.
So they were the best customers. Those are the people you really enjoyed.
Yeah, and do you remember, so I have observed this in some scenarios where you can kind of tell that the patron in your booth, they'll buy your work regardless of like what the work is. It's almost like they don't really, they like it all, and so they just want to vet you, the artist, and figure out whether you're for real or not.
Sometimes I found people buying me. After I did my whole thing, talked to them, got to know that person, shared part of my life, shared part of the experience, I could see them even more interested in bringing home a piece.
Yeah.
So that was, like I said, it's a unique space.
Man, that takes a lot of work. I mean, if you're out, on a 2 or 3 day weekend, and you're talking to people left and right and trying to get to know people, I mean, that takes a lot of energy.
It's really interesting because after doing years and years of shows, of course, you get the standard question all the time.
Yeah.
And a lot of artists refer to it as, oh, God, the stupid question again. I got to answer the stupid question.
Right.
And to us, it's so obvious.
Right.
To them, it's the first time they ever saw it. So you go through this over and over. But then there are many, many examples that they share themselves also. It's more than just that next stupid question.
Right.
I have a story. I sold a puzzle once to a gal in a Minneapolis show, and she was completely frustrated. I mean, she couldn't make a decision between this one or that one or this, and she went back and forth and back and forth. She finally walked away and almost passed out.
Really?
And she came back and purchased a piece. And I said, well, that was kind of a strange sale. I mean, it was a little bit different than most.
You took her breath away, Steve.
Yeah, I did. Well, hopefully the piece did, not me. But I think it's maybe 8 or 10 years later, I'm doing a show in Los Angeles now. And this gal comes in and she says, I bought one of your puzzles. That's, this maybe 10,000 puzzles later. I really don't know. And I said, where was that? And she told me it was in Minneapolis. And she said, don't you remember me? I said, not really, not yet. She says, I'm the gal who had a really hard time making a decision. And I actually went out and I sat down and almost passed out. And I said, oh my God, I do remember this. This is something, normally doesn't happen. She says, I have to tell you something. She says, I have your puzzle. And she pulled it out. It was like 18 years later out of her purse. And she says, this puzzle has been therapy for me. She says, like you see, I have a hard time making decisions. And I kind of forget the word. But she gets a little too over-involved. And it gets to her. And she says, I have memorized your puzzle. And this happens to me often in life. And when it does, I sit down and I take this puzzle out. It wasn't a big one. She could do it after she memorized it. I bet you she could do it in 2, 3, 4 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And she says it refocuses me. And she had made a little felt bag for this puzzle. She says, I've carried this with me for 10 years now.
Wow.
So it's those kind of sales that really make you think about what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Man, that's a good story. That's see, and that I think that's what you would hope as an artist, right?
That's what moves you.
Yeah, it's like I'm not just decorating your house or whatever.
Exactly.
It's,
I mean, money makes a difference, but
right.
when you touch someone, they touch you like that.
Right.
That's what we're all about.
And it keeps the process alive, right, of your work. It's not like you buy it once, you look at it, and you're like, okay, cool. It's every time you look at it, or every time you interact with it, right, there's something new, something different as you grow older, right? She had it for what, 8 or 10 years?
8 or 10 years.
So
she told me 10 years.
Yeah, so if she probably did that puzzle however many times, it's, it means something different for her each time.
Exactly.
It's not
it was a little bit different than a piece of playable artwork that people come in and say, oh my God, this is amazing. They may take a couple of pieces out or talk about it. She actually used it as a therapy tool.
That's so great. And that's actually, you have a great, I think on your website, you have a great line in your bio.
Remind me.
Piece by piece.
Yeah.
That's such a good, so it's PEACE by PIECE.
Yeah.
So that's such a good, I mean, that captures kind of the spirit of it, right?
Well, I've ran this for, life changes kind of took me away from actually being in my studio making puzzles all the time now. I'm still doing commissions and other pieces occasionally, but life circumstances kind of changed that. But I ran this for many years, and it was the piece by piece that did it. It was passion, and it was something I really enjoyed doing. Like I said, you came into my little 10-foot space, and you came in there because you were interested,
right?
Whether it be looking at me, looking at my booth, looking at the pieces, whatever it was, we connected. And you get, you get petted. People come in, they normally don't say, oh, this sucks. They come in and say, oh, this is beautiful.
Yeah.
And then it just, it lightens you up.
Yeah.
The compliments are worth almost as much as the income, even although you need the income to create the next show or buy materials for the next piece.
Yeah, that's... And you do get those, those jackasses every once in a while, right? That come in. But overall, it's, probably 90%, 99% of the people that walk through, like you said, it helps you stay on course, keeps you going and keeps you motivated.
I've had people come in and say, I hate doing puzzles, but this is beautiful.
Right. It's, where they try and backtrack, right, and realize that you're trying to make a living.
Eat your toes.
Yeah, that's so good. That's a good way of describing your work too. I mean, you literally make it piece by piece because it's handmade, and you want to. So, I guess let's back up. How did you get the idea to start doing the kind of multi-layered, stretching a 2-dimensional jigsaw puzzle into more of the 3 dimensions? Because that's probably pretty hard to make. Right?
It's just something that evolved. You realize you can make so many designs from keeping it in a single layer format. And then at one point it was like, well, I could start stacking, and I could create now dimensional designs. So it's just something that evolves. You spend enough time doing one thing, you're going to get bored. You're going to have to figure out something else to make it a little bit bigger and better than before.
How do you incorporate I think there was one piece I saw in your booth one time where you had a mountain range, and each kind of, I don't know if there's a word for this effect, but sometimes when you look at the Colorado mountain landscape, you'll see the front mountains, and then in the back, there's a layer of fog that kind of makes that next layer of mountains, a little dimmer. And there's maybe a third one that's peeking out from behind that. And it's even more,
I work with all natural color woods. So part of it is using color to your advantage. Brighter colors up front, darker colors as they go back, so it kind of gives it a little bit more depth to it.
So you really read the material. So you literally go into your shop and you have to read the material. Like what pieces of wood do I have? So do you start with that, or do you kind of start with an idea of what you want the piece to look like?
You know, after a while, you come up with, like, the landscapes were kind of a bread and butter. You know, they were random landscapes. They weren't taken directly from the Sandia Mountains or wherever. So they were kind of very routine for me. They're very easy to make, but you do have to look at certain colors. I mean, you don't put green and orange and purple together and expect it to look good. So, and my pieces were very organic, so I worked with very natural, softer tones. And again, contrasts really work well. It was hard to make a really nice looking piece without using a black wood and a whitish wood mixed in to really highlight your browns and your yellow woods. And grain, the figure in a grain, makes a beautiful sky.
Yeah.
So, you know, finding exotic wood.
What kind of wood do you like?
Oh, you know, cocobolo's a beautiful wood. All that stuff. It's funny, back in the day when I started, wood was very affordable. Now it's going out there and like buying gold.
Yeah, that's well, so Albuquerque hardwoods went out maybe a couple of years ago.
I think even longer than that. Paxton's was our best source way back in the day, and Paxton has been gone in Albuquerque for probably 30 years now, 30 years.
So I got some wood from the Paxton that's in Denver, and they still stock, you know, some of the exotics, but it's you know, here in Albuquerque, I was like, hey, can I get any of this stuff here? And
there's no retail shop anymore here.
Yeah, so that's kind of unfortunate, you know. Like you said, when you were starting out, it was all of it was readily available.
Yeah, I have no idea what Cocobolo sells for a linear foot now. I think it's somewhere in high $30.
Yeah.
Back in the day, I remember buying 100 feet of it at $3 a foot.
Oh my God.
You know, and that's how much it's increased. And,
oh man,
you know, there's the whole issue about abusing the forest, which most of the wood I use is scrap size. It's your bigger industries. It's your stripping the forest for a cattle range.
Right.
Because meat will bring in more money than a forest will.
Right. Well, and then even it's a pretty global product. I mean, a lot of those exotic hardwoods, I mean, they're native to different countries all around the world. And so they, you know, whether it's in the States or not that they're, you know, harvesting it from, you know, but they've all gone up in price, and they've seemingly all, you know, become harder to get regardless of where they came from.
Yeah, trees don't grow overnight.
Yeah, sure don't.
But we could use the wood overnight.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I mean, I would have thought that the exotic woods maybe would have not gone up as much, just because, you know, people aren't necessarily making huge dining tables out of them, but I guess they're being sought after.
There are industries that do use it in that realm, yeah.
And so for you, it was great because you could use, you know, real small quantities and get really nice.
My material investment was minimal.
Yeah.
I mean, if I bought a 1-inch thick piece of wood, I could resaw it down into, because my pieces were probably 3/16 of an inch thick finished out.
Okay. Right.
Or maybe even a little bit less.
Right. So you're using just slices basically, just for the.
So I used very little material.
Those little cardboard jigsaw puzzle pieces. I mean, imagine how thin that is. It's, you know, they're not thick at all, and so, you know, an inch board will go a long way.
It did go a long way. Yep. Out of every linear foot, I got 3 slabs.
Right. Well, that's good too. I mean, that's like, you know, normally that stuff probably wouldn't have been used for a whole lot, and so you were able to pick up these, you know, still valuable pieces of wood and turn it into something even more valuable.
I did work a lot with other people's scraps in the beginning, but then as you start producing more and more, you have to set up more of a production way of approaching.
Yeah.
So, for me to resaw a piece of wood, it needs to be at least 4 feet long so I could run it through the belt sander.
Right.
Otherwise, a little piece gets eaten up and you wonder, is out in your dust collector somewhere.
Dust collector, or shoots out in your shop, or yeah, that is a good point. I mean, you have to, like you said, you have to at some point take it seriously and get it more consistent. That way your end product is consistent.
Yeah, and I turned up, as you go along, I was, like I said, the landscapes were a bread and butter item. They were very easy to make, very natural to work with. The wood grains led themselves to landscapes. But my challenge was coming up with abstracts and something that created more of a challenge as a puzzle, presented itself as a tabletop or shelf piece, just as beautiful. And then I'd start working into my original educational background was in architecture, so I started doing more architectural pieces.
Right. Yeah, I love that pyramidal. It was an upside down pyramidal.
551 it was
551,
called. Because there were 551 pieces and 36 layers deep.
Yeah, so it looks like you used some Wenge,
Arriba.
sterling silver. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. That way people can see it, because it's really spectacular. And you also have the cradle of peace. I mean, these get very, very impressive.
Thank you.
It's and especially at the scale, because they're, I think if you had a bigger scale, it might be easier to work with just the wood, but on a smaller scale, I'd imagine that's very tricky to get right.
Yeah, it became a very different approach, and I really wasn't the kind of guy that would draw out an image and say, this is what I'm going to make. I would have a mental image. I would start making it and then realize the restrictions I have with working as delicately as I did. So the original image would very often be very different than the final piece.
Right.
And for me, it was an evolution. It was more enjoyable than trying to make that drawing. We sat down, myself and that piece of wood, we'd sit down, or those pieces of wood, we'd sit down and we'd watch what happened with it.
Right. Have a little conversation with those pieces.
And sometimes you wouldn't want to hear the words.
That's pretty good. So you said your background was in architecture. I would say it seems to me like architecture, you start with the boundaries, right? And you try and figure out, okay, how can I get this mental image to fit in these boundaries? And it seems like the process you're describing with your puzzles was more of, I have the image, which boundaries do I need to push, a little bit?
How far can I
take them?
Yeah.
And so it really is an interesting difference between, pre-made design and architecture. I say pre-made, but it's more, you're conforming to
predetermined.
You're conforming to the engineering standards and the space and all that. But with your puzzles, I mean, like you said, when you start getting into it, you find out, oh yeah, I can, this is a little bit more difficult, but I can push this, this grain texture into this pattern, or I can,
Yeah, I think out of all the pieces I made, which add up to quite a few, I very rarely scrapped a piece.
That's pretty
as
good.
you go along, you realize, well, it's not going to work out that way, but I can make it work this way.
That sounds like, a true artist, right? It's not throwing away or scrapping or giving up on something. I think
Giving up is a good way to look at it.
Right.
I'm not going to give up on this. I can make it this way instead now.
Right. That's
sometimes the mistakes,
yeah,
or the tangents brought you to even a better place than your original concept.
How often did that happen, do you think? And
with the sculptural pieces, like I said, they were in evolution.
Yeah.
So myself and those pieces of wood just worked ourselves into as close as what we thought that original concept was going to be.
Did you ever get any real crazy commissions?
Yeah. Yeah. Since you could edit this out. Yeah. There was one point where I was making letter openers because I have all these beautiful exotic woods. At one point, I cannot use them in a puzzle.
Right.
So I came up with letter openers.
Right.
Now I could laminate some different woods together, and then what was left over, even smaller than that, I came up with hair sticks, which were used as weaving tools sometimes for weavers. And so I had hair sticks up in a gallery in Santa Fe, and the owner of the gallery was a very conservative gal, and she sends me a letter one day. She said, "Steve, I think you would be interested in this. There's a woman who purchased a letter opener, and she said, you should consider making a wooden dildo." So I'm thinking,
Of course.
Here's this letter's a fraud, one of my artist friends.
Right.
In the shows, artists can get pretty crazy, and we play a lot of pranks on each other. And so I'm thinking one of my artist friends visited the gallery, made up this letter, gave it to Jane to give to me, and I kind of ignored it. I said, this isn't going to be real, and especially coming from Jane. She was such a conservative gal.
Yeah.
So here I am years later doing a show in New York City, and this woman comes walking up to me, and she goes, "Did you ever get my letter? I bought a letter opener from you in Santa Fe at a gallery." And I said, "What letter is that?" She said, "Well, I suggested you make a wooden dildo." I said, "That's for real? You were real?" And she goes, "Yes." She says, "I have to tell you, I used your letter opener for that. And I thought you could refine it more for me." And she says, "My husband would go away. He worked out as a scientist, and sometimes he'd be gone for months at a time.
Yeah.
And your letter opener helped our relationship." She said, "You really should consider doing one for me." Well, that was a commission I never did get to, but it was kind of interesting.
So that means that the surface finish on your wood was just top notch. I mean,
I have to say that wood is an interesting, because people would come in and touch your pieces and hold the letter openers, and it's so soft. Where literally, you take a piece of, here's a letter opener, you hit a hard surface.
Right.
And it's not soft at all.
Right.
But if you finish it well enough to the finger, wood feels so soft and sensual.
That's such an interesting material too, because it's it is more human, more relatable than
it is very organic material. It started live.
Yeah. That's interesting. I'm not that well versed in woodworking. I can do the very basics. And I haven't really thought about that. Like you said, like to the touch versus, how strong it is, how durable it is.
Well, it was funny how often people would say how soft it feels.
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of times at art shows, you'll find that all the people going through your booth will bring up, right, these small points that either you knew about and didn't want to, publicize, or it's not something you normally talk about, but everyone keeps mentioning these little things. You're like, oh yeah, I guess that's, that is an interesting thing that I guess the average person is astounded by, or they find interesting. But to you, it's like, that's just second nature, right?
Well, I do know that the more you work wood, the more organic it becomes.
You kind of develop...
The smoother, the softer, whatever words they want to use.
Yeah.
It is a really strong material. And it is quite hard. I mean, you don't want to get hit by a 2x4. Right.
Much
it's
less
not going to bend around your head.
Much less a Cocobolo slab.
Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, dense wood is really heavy.
Yeah. That's like an intuition that you really can't get unless you've been working in an industry or in a medium for a long time, I'd imagine. And I find that with, at least for myself, I mean, I would consider myself an artist, but a very amateur artist, because I've only been making things for a couple of years, really. But I've noticed that the artists that I know who've been working at something, or in, metal, wood, whatever material, after the, 10, 20-year mark, 30-year mark, they start getting these, they can feel how the material is going to react. And they can kind of, it's almost like a sixth sense of when you're making something, they know they can literally read a piece of material and they know how to use it and they know where it's going to go wrong or where it's going to go right. And I think you've clearly developed that skill, and that's something that, I notice when I hear you talk about it. It's these little details that...
Yeah, and you learn your limitations.
Mm-hmm.
You know how far you could push it.
Right.
Because you don't want to scrap a piece.
Right.
Especially after you invest a lot of hours into it.
Right. And that's also, I'd say that's a good skill, is you can't just be overzealous, right?
Yeah.
You gotta watch both ends of, keeping your work in an evolving state, but also keeping the business running and keeping it.
Yeah, that's always a tough balance.
Yeah.
Because I think most of the artists I know are very creative spirits,
mm-hmm.
and they have to keep that balance between, I am a business,
mm-hmm.
I do have to support this, I want to do this for a living.
Yeah.
So what's my compromise? How far? And that's usually why you see some people out there who have, like for me, my bread and butter line, and then I had my larger pieces, my sculptural pieces.
Right.
And that's where I get to really let my spirit fly. But at the same time, I have to let my business mind work too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, like I said, that's so, it's not as common as you'd think. And I think the fact that you're still here, making work, however often you can get to it, this far down the line after you started, I think that's a testament to how good you were at finding that balance.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people come and go.
Yeah.
And the key sometimes, I think for me, was I was very focused. I was the puzzle guy.
Mm-hmm.
So they knew, I didn't try to do this and that and this and that.
Yeah.
So when you came to my booth, you were going to buy a puzzle. And there were people who were out there who would, from year to year, buy a puzzle. I just got an email today. Someone went to my website, and of course it's a little outdated. I haven't been on it and updated it in a while. And they questioned, "Are you still doing? Can I still have you make pieces for me?" And
Mm-hmm.
I'll get on the email tonight and say, "Yes, please."
Nice. That's what we like to hear.
Yeah.
If I'll put a few pictures on my website and
Terrific.
have a link from the podcast. That way you can find Steve's website, and you can see all the work that he's done, and you can maybe get some ideas for some commissions or something, and you can see just the breadth of talent that Steve's has now.
I have had bigger commissions. I thought that one would be a little bit more entertaining than most of the others, but no, every year I came up with a design that I later scaled down so it would be more affordable, but I had a patron from the Tucson area that bought from me every year.
Mm-hmm. And
he bought a sculpture. First he bought a very large, like a $1,200 landscape, and then he got into some of the sculptural pieces, and he says, I think I bought like 5 pieces from you now, and I want you to make me something. He says, and what we do is every Christmas I bring this to the family, and we sit down and do your puzzle. And that's something I want to talk about too, about puzzles. But so this was an event that he shared.
Yeah.
Each time he bought a piece from me, he says, I want you to now make me something that's going to be really challenging, not only beautiful to look at, but I really want to be challenged. And that's when I came up with what I call the 3-layer rings. But his first piece was quite big. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, well, this is a great idea, and this is a really challenging puzzle. And we scaled it down to a more sellable piece.
Right. I remember, I think I remember which ones you're talking about. I'll have to find the picture.
Yeah, I think they're on the website. That was the other thing I wanted to say about the puzzles when I got into the puzzles. It's if you're a puzzle person, it's a time when you sit down, you shut down the rest of the world, and you focus on a piece and where it goes. Mm-hmm. And there's a little bit of, with every piece, there's a little bit of satisfaction and completion every time you make a piece fit. And if you're a puzzle person, you'll relate to what I'm saying. Yeah. And then the closer you get to the end, it's one of those challenges that gets easier the closer you get to the end. So in a way, that's even more rewarding, because now it's like only this, only this, only this.
Right.
And then you complete it.
Right. That's the energy and the momentum of that kind of, building.
It's there was that, and how. Here's another story too. I have a really, one of my favorite bands is the String Cheese Incident, and years ago they did a show here in Albuquerque at the Wool Warehouse, and I laminated up a couple of their posters, and I cut them up into puzzles. So I laid out tables, and during intermission or whatever, it was in a really nice environment. People would come out, and I watched people sit and do puzzles, these puzzles together, and they'd be interacting like they knew each other forever. They're talking about this and that, and I'm watching people exchanging telephone numbers after sitting down and sharing the puzzle together.
That's such a good just image that we don't really have that today. And as far as like a place where you can sit down and concentrate and kind of make friends, on a small scale like that, right? That's it is something that people share, even when you put a cardboard puzzle on a table. Yeah. Someone walks in, and this is my experience. They always look over and say, "Oh, I found a piece," Right. Then they'll walk away. And the difference with my puzzles to a cardboard puzzle, when you were done, you didn't put it back in the box. You put it up on the shelf. Yeah. I mean, your pieces are so nice that you put it on the shelf above your bed. You put it, you put it on your altar, because I'd imagine, putting your pieces together, especially like the challenging ones, like you said, isn't just, about, okay, done, moving on. It's, you're just pausing and reflecting. I mean, that's Satori, right? And it's, there's just that moment of
that. And with my puzzles compared to the cardboard puzzles, because it's solid wood, they're finished on both sides. So a lot of times you're looking at a piece upside down, and you have to try to visualize it right side up if you want to make it fit in that space that's available. And it's like, is it going to be right if I flip it over? And so it increased the challenge quite a bit too.
That's, I don't know why I didn't think about that before, but that literally makes it at least twice as hard.
Yeah. And then when you brought up before about how I used layering for dimension more, even though you only saw a small part of that, say, second layer, third layer, fourth layer, it went completely under the first one. So there are a lot more pieces than the puzzle actually presents itself as.
Right. So I'll make sure that image is linked below, so you can see where it's. You'll look at it and you'll see the 3 layers, but you could basically put the bottom layer together.
You have to do that one first.
You have to do it first, and it's a complete image in and of itself. And like you said, the pieces are finished, and then you have to start on the next one. So it really is. It
is a universal frame all the ways around, even though you're seeing a partial area of that bottom layer.
Right.
But there are pieces all the ways underneath it.
So, Steve, you're a puzzle master then, because you put them together, but you also had to cut them. So you knew that, like, when that commission came in, where he's like, I want to be challenged, how hard was it for you to actually, think through how difficult do I make this? Because making a puzzle to me sounds, it's like, I guess I could randomly cut, shapes, but ultimately it seems like there's got to be more thought there, and it seems like it'd take a genius to.
I don't think too many people have referred to me as a genius, but
that's it. Look at his puzzles, and you'll agree with me.
Cutting the pieces was a very zen thing. Once you did your design, your inlay, your overlay. I did a lot of design by overlay with the layering. So that was really more of a challenge than cutting the pieces. Cutting the pieces at that point was kind of a zen time. It was a time where I needed to look at what I was doing. I never drew out a piece. I cut enough to where I knew what I had to do to make a perfect piece. You come in, and I used to call it, you come in and make a turn at the neck, and then you enlarge the head area of that lobe, and you come back in and tighten up the neck, and then move out and make sure you do one of them on how many ever sides you had on that piece, so it would lock together. It wouldn't come apart.
And what kind of saw are you using?
I use a scroll saw, tabletop scroll saw, and the blade I use is 8.5 thousandths of an inch.
Tiny.
In kerf, yeah.
Tiny, yeah.
And a good blade, I'd be lucky if I could get 2-3 minutes out of a blade.
Really?
And that's all. It evened out. It's a matter of patience. The slower I cut, of course, with any blade, any kind of machine you use,
sure,
you can only move as fast as the blade is cutting. But you could push it a little bit. But if you push a little bit, a blade that small heats up, and there goes your carbon tension, and you pop it. So it's a slow process. It moves faster than people imagine. But when you're on this end of the saw, it's pretty
feels
slow.
pretty. Yeah, I can imagine. And so you got all your fingers still. That's,
yeah,
that's
with the blade like that. Even if you stuck your finger in it, you have time to get it out before it does much damage.
Yeah. Well, that's comforting to know, because typically woodworking, if you're in woodworking for 30 plus years, I mean, you get some close calls.
Yeah, most guys I know with stubs have a joiner. I didn't use a joiner too much. I do use a lot of tools. I mean, I resaw my wood originally down to the slabs, to the thickness I need. So I have a good sized bandsaw for that. The framework, all the puzzles were backed on a piece of 4/4 alder. So then I trim it with table saw, radial arm, and then it goes to sanders. So I do use all of my tools. The scroll saw is my main, where I spend most of my time, though.
Oh, cool. I'd say if you were to order all of the tools and machines you have, in your process, there's always, for every artist, there's that one, right?
That really makes it happen.
Yeah, that's cool. Anything else you want to mention about either doing art shows for a living,
I think we
doing
should
the
talk
puzzles?
a little bit more about art shows and the community of people.
Yeah.
From the artist end. And I chose to do most of my sales through retail at art shows. I ventured into galleries. They were great. They take quite a hit from you. And more than the money part, I like the interaction of the sale. And along with that came a community of artists that I have not found anywhere else in my life. It's kind of a nomadic.
Yeah.
We all have home bases, but we hit the road for a week. Some people will go on a circuit down to Florida, do a Florida circuit for 2-3 months, which I did myself, got a motorhome and lived in Florida out of my motorhome for a month or two and did art shows. The people you meet, the friends I have across the nation, I don't think I could have found in any other business.
Yeah, I agree. It's so unique for so many reasons that it is hard to describe. And every artist that I know has the similar story of, it's one thing to just set up your tent and sell whatever you're making, and then to drive there and drive back home and make more, right? But it's everything outside of the show hours that is, it's almost like 80%, 20%. All the artists, all the business is 20% of the deal. 80% of the deal is after hours, friends that you meet, that you make.
The dinners, the gatherings. In a
different city too, so it's such a changing environment. Same people, different environment. Yeah.
Yep. And it's funny, you could drive into Chicago. You find yourself doing the 5th time at a Chicago show, and here you are driving into Chicago, and you're at home. Just where to go, what restaurants to go to. Right. You're already texting each other saying, I'll meet you for beer afterwards. And I think we touched upon this a little bit before our interview, that for a while there I had a Greyhound bus as a motorhome, and it seemed like a lot of my close artist friends would end up in the bus. So we kind of took off our artist costume, which we wear, right, which is very real. I mean, it's part of us, but we are answering the same questions over and over again, interacting with people. But then afterwards, when we get together, is when our creative spirits are allowed to fly in conversation and opinions and beliefs and spirituality. And that's when you really get to know the great community.
That's so interesting too, because I think we talked about this, how there's, there's a first layer to the artist that the patrons get when they talk to you in your booth, and they figure out, oh, wow, they have, really great ideas about how they make their work and design and whatnot. And now you're describing, there's an even second layer to artists. When artists get together,
there are many layers.
There are many, many layers. And it's so cool though, that there's, someone's learning at every level, whether it's you, the artist, the patron, your friends. I mean, it seems like it's just a community of, never ending learning and sharing knowledge and experiences.
That's so true. And they're a very sincere group. There's no facade needed, because we're a community that's looked at by the public as being a little eccentric. So we're allowed to be ourselves. We don't have to hide anything.
Right. Yeah, it's so freeing. I'd imagine that, you're not wearing a suit. You're not, you don't have a script to read off of. You're just kind of being you, and it's very free. I mean, it's a fortunate, probably a fortunate way to make a living.
I would not trade it for anything. It's not. Yeah. It hasn't been the highest income I've ever experienced in the different ventures I've taken, but experience-wise, I would never trade it.
Yeah.
I mean, could you imagine sitting in your personal space with all of your personal production, everything you put your heart and soul into, and 500 people come in a day to talk to you? I mean, that's a treat. How often do you get to do that? And most everyone that comes in is in awe of what you do.
Right.
So you're not talking to someone who doesn't like you or your work. You're immediately making a friend.
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting. It really is such a. I mean, I wouldn't say it's self-ingratiating, but really it kind of is. It's your time to shine, because you've already put in all the hard work ahead of time, and then you get the feedback, and a lot of it is positive.
Yeah, they wouldn't come in if they really didn't like it.
Right.
Most people.
Right. You see the 1,000 people say, nah. And then you get the,
But then you got to wonder when you're doing an art show and, the guy next to you, his booth or her booth on the other side is like chock full, and they're walking right by yours, and you're going, whoop, what did I do wrong?
Yeah, and it's, I'm sure that I've seen that happen many times, and, it could just be for extraneous reasons. It's always different when you do enough shows.
Every show is different.
Right.
Every city you go to is a different clientele.
Yeah.
And my work was pretty focused into one area. They were, very intricate, exotic, playable pieces, and not everyone's into it. But then I do shows where, there are people lined up with 3 puzzles in their hand waiting for the 3 people in front of them to make their purchase.
Right. We'll definitely have to do it again.
Okay.
Another
Sounds
interview.
Great.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Apollo Road 001 with Steve Malavolta. You can find Steve's work at stevemalavolta.com. That's STEVEMALAVOLTA.com. You can also head over to apolloroad.com/podcast to find the show notes and transcript for this episode, as well as more info and links related to Steve and his work. If you enjoyed this podcast, I'd appreciate if you filled out a short survey. I've got a little questionnaire also on apolloroad.com/podcast about this episode, what you liked, what you didn't like. If you have any requests for future guests, or even if you have a question for Steve, I can relay to him. You can wander over there and support the podcast. Currently, I'm bootstrapping this thing. I produce a small line of work for sale on my website. So feel free to show your support any way you can. And I'm excited for the next episode. Hope you are too. Take care.